Today, March 28th, is the 80th anniversary of the death of pianist, conductor, and composer Sergei Rachmaninoff. Saturday, April 1st, is the 150th anniversary of his birth. Welcome to the Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. And thank you so much for joining me for this tribute to one of Russia's most important musical figures. I'd like to preface this discussion by re-emphasizing a point that I'd made in my previous video on Tchaikovsky from a few weeks ago. When we're talking about a composer and his work, it's very important to keep separated three principles. On the one hand, there's the actual biographical events of a composer's life. Then there is the composer's general sense of life and philosophical outlook. And then there is the composer's actual creative output. And there are very complex interactions between these three elements. On the one hand, there's a reciprocal relationship between the events that a composer experiences in his private life, in his career, and his conscious convictions, his sense of life, his outlook on the world. And then there's also a reciprocal, mutually reinforcing relationship between the composer's sense of life and his creative output. But we still have to be careful to keep these ideas conceptually separate, because confusing them can lead us into all sorts of problems. And I mentioned the mistake that I'd made many, many years ago of interpreting Tchaikovsky's Pathetique Symphony as a kind of farewell or musical suicide letter, which in fact, it's nothing of the sort. The piece is a product of that composer's general fatalistic outlook on life, but it was actually composed at a time when his personal and professional circumstances couldn't possibly have been better. What I'd like to do today is, rather than rehashing things about Rachmaninoff that you already know, I'd like to give you a few insights, hopefully tell you something about his life, about his outlook on the world that you didn't already know. In particular, we're going to view a few examples of his creative work from a very particular lens. So let's begin with the biography. Let's begin with the basic concrete facts. Rachmaninoff was born in 1873, died in 1943. He excelled in three areas: as a virtuoso pianist, one of the finest of his generation; as a conductor of operatic and symphonic music. For example, he conducted at the Bolshoi for a number of years; and of course, as a composer. Rachmaninoff studied at the Moscow Conservatory when he was in his teens, and he graduated at around the time when he turned 20. One very important piece that he composed when he was still a student at the conservatory is his Piano Concerto No. 1, Opus 1, a splendid piece, which he later on revised and made even better some decades later. If you don't know that piece, I highly recommend it. An important watershed in Rachmaninoff's career, I would say an important crisis in his career, occurred when he was in his early 20s, and that has to do with the composition of his Symphony No. 1, a piece which we'll be hearing some excerpts from a little bit later on. Rachmaninoff composed his first symphony around 1895-96, and it premiered in 1897. The first public performance was a disaster. The symphony was very badly played. It was panned by all the critics. The audience was cold in its reception, and this resulted in the first of two major crises for this particular composer, where he actually abandoned composition for quite a number of years. There was a period of about 3 years where Rachmaninoff was unable to write any music because of the trauma of the terrible first performance and reception of his first symphony. I should mention that the premiere of Rachmaninoff's first symphony was conducted by Alexander Glazunov, another very fine Russian composer, pedagogue, who later on became a professor at the conservatory. Glazunov was a prodigy. He was a pupil of Rimsky-Korsakov. Unfortunately, he was a notorious alcoholic, perhaps something that's not all that unusual in Russia. And I've heard rumors to the effect that Glazunov was actually inebriated at the time when he conducted the premiere of Rachmaninoff's First Symphony, which may have been a contributing factor to the disastrous performance and terrible reception of that work. Nonetheless, Rachmaninoff went through these years of crisis when he was unable to compose, and it wasn't until he actually received professional help from a neuroscientist and therapist that he was able to work through some of his problems and return to composition, which he did triumphantly in the years 1900 to 1901. And the work which marked his rehabilitation as a composer was the ever popular Piano Concerto No. 2, a work which I imagine is familiar to many people in this audience. And that was followed by a series of very important works, including the Symphony No. 2, one of the great post-romantic symphonies, very Tchaikovskyan in its mood and style. Another piece that I highly recommend to our viewers today. That was composed around 1904 and 5, very well received. I should mention that Rachmaninoff is not one of the most prolific of composers, and part of it is because he was so busy as a pianist, so busy as a conductor, that his activities as a composer were mainly limited to weekends, to holidays. In this respect, Rachmaninoff is somewhat comparable to Gustav Mahler, who had a very busy conducting career and who also tended to compose mainly on holidays and during periods where he wasn't so busy with operatic and symphonic conducting. A few other important works date from this period, this middle period of Rachmaninoff's career. The Isle of the Dead, a very important symphonic poem inspired by a famous painting, and we'll look at the painting and listen to a little bit of that music later on as well. The Third Piano Concerto dates from 1909. That's another very great work, considered one of the most difficult piano concertos in the repertoire. In many ways, easily comparable to any of the very challenging pieces by Franz Liszt and other great virtuoso composers of the 19th century. That was followed a couple of years later by a choral symphony called The Bells, inspired by a famous work of Edgar Allan Poe. That's a symphony with voices using the text from Edgar Allan Poe's famous work, The Bells. Very interesting piece. And then, of course, in 1918 came the revolution. And I would say this was the second great crisis in Rachmaninoff's personal and professional life. Rachmaninoff came from the upper classes, he was descended from the Russian aristocracy. So, of course, with the revolution, things became very uncomfortable for Rachmaninoff and his family. So at the onset of the revolution in the year 1918, he left his homeland together with his wife and their two daughters, never to return. After leaving Russia, Rachmaninoff never again returned, never again set foot on Russian soil for the remaining quarter of a century of his life. And I think we can certainly understand that Rachmaninoff was haunted in the last 2.5 decades of his life by nostalgia, homesickness. No doubt he had many friends, colleagues, relatives left in the Soviet Russia, but he wasn't able to see them. So basically, America became his home from that point on. He undertook many arduous and very difficult concert tours as a way of supporting himself and his family. So he was very busy doing concert tours on both sides of the Atlantic, not only throughout North America, but also in France and Germany and other parts of Europe. But the nostalgia, the homesickness took its toll on Rachmaninoff's creativity. And so for a period of about 8 years, almost a decade, Rachmaninoff wrote no new music from about 1918 to 1926. Then in 1926, Rachmaninoff returned to composition and embarked upon a series of very major works, but only a handful of pieces, only about a half dozen pieces in the last decade and a half of his career. But these are very substantial pieces, beginning with the Piano Concerto No. 4, another really excellent piece that I encourage people to get to know. Then we have, from the last few years of Rachmaninoff's life, a trio of absolute masterpieces. unquestioned masterpieces. The famous and ever popular Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini for piano and orchestra. We'll hear a little bit of that later on. The Symphony No. 3 in A minor, another fantastic piece. And Rachmaninoff's last major work, the Symphonic Dances for Orchestra, composed just a year or two before his death. Those are the basic facts of Rachmaninoff's life. And I want to stress that to understand his output, to understand his outlook on life, we have to know a little bit about particularly the two creative crises, the one early in his career, resulting from the disastrous fiasco of the Symphony No. 1, and then the sort of mid to late career crisis of relocating from his homeland as a result of the Russian Revolution, being separated from his home country and many of his loved ones for the remainder of his life. So it's not surprising that Rachmaninoff's basic philosophy, basic sense of life tended to be a fairly negative one. And here I want to make a direct comparison with Tchaikovsky, whom we discussed a few weeks ago. Like Tchaikovsky, whom Rachmaninoff idolized and emulated throughout his career, and like many great Russian creative artists, Rachmaninoff was a fatalist who was haunted by death. And this is something that comes through not only in his writings and comments, but also very much in his creative work. And I want to draw a bit of a comparison between Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky. In my previous discussion, I mentioned that the idea of fate, the idea of destiny, is something that permeates a lot of Tchaikovsky's creative work, beginning with his Pushkin-inspired opera, Yevgeny Onegin, and continuing through the late symphonies, the fourth, fifth, and sixth symphonies. And more specifically, I mentioned that for the descending scale, a descending melodic pattern, was an emblem of fatalism. And I even took the example of the finale of the Pathetique Symphony as one particular illustration of this. People may ask, well, why did Tchaikovsky use a descending scale as an emblem or insignia of fate? And that's by no means necessary or obligatory. There is a kind of sense in which there's a tradition in Western music of viewing rising melodies or rising scales as being associated with optimism or affirmation, and viewing descending scales or descending melodies as emblematic of resignation or inevitability. And please don't read too much into that. I'm not suggesting that every melody by every composer be viewed through this particular lens. Rather, this is one particular device of signification among many that composers could rely upon to communicate specific ideas to their listeners. So for Tchaikovsky, the descending scale was an emblem of fatalism and eventually of death as well. For Rachmaninoff, the musical symbol of fate and death is something called the Dies Irae. The Dies Irae. So the Dies Irae is a late medieval text and melody. So it's a text, a Latin text, but it's also a melody that accompanied that particular text. It's very important that we keep those two things separate. The Latin words, on the other hand, which are Dies Irae, Dies illa, solvet secum in favilla, teste David cum Sibylla, which means day of wrath, that day when the world will dissolve in ashes, as foretold by David and the Sibyls. So it's an evocation of the day of judgment. That's the Latin text. But then the melody is something that's actually separate from that. And let's actually listen to a little bit of the melody here together with the Latin text so you can get an idea. And I'll show you how this is relevant to Rachmaninoff's music in a moment. Here's the authentic chant melody, the Dies Irae. Dies Irae, dies illa, solvet secum in favilla, teste David cum Sibylla. So why am I at such pains to emphasize the differentiation here between the text and the melody? Well, because there we heard the text and the melody together, but in the last few centuries, some composers have just used the Latin text, the words, and composed their own music to accompany it. For example, Mozart in his famous Requiem uses the words that we just heard, but he composes his own original music. And many other composers have done that as well. Berlioz, Verdi, Fauré, just to mention a few famous composers who've written requiems. That's the Roman Catholic Mass for the dead is the Requiem. And then some composers have taken just the melody without the words, just the melody that we heard, and used it as a basis for instrumental compositions. Two very famous examples of that are by the French composer Hector Berlioz. In his Symphonie Fantastique, he uses the melody of the Dies Irae, and also Franz Liszt in his Totentanz, which means Dance of Death, a work for piano and orchestra, which is a set of variations on the Dies Irae melody. Other composers who've used the Dies Irae include Tchaikovsky in his Manfred Symphony, Gustav Mahler in his Resurrection Symphony, and many, many others. In fact, in recent decades, even film composers have used the Dies Irae. For example, the Stanley Kubrick film The Shining uses it quite prominently. But if there's one composer who was obsessed with the Dies Irae, using it in many, many different works across his career, that was Sergei Rachmaninoff. So now we're going to look closely at Rachmaninoff's use of Irae, bearing in mind that just as for Tchaikovsky, the descending melody or descending scale was an emblem or an insignia of fatalism and death, so for Rachmaninoff, the Dies Irae, the melody that we heard, is an emblem of death and fatalism. Let's just listen to the melody in its original form one more time, and then we'll turn to some examples of how Rachmaninoff uses this in his creative work. Here's the original Dies Irae. And very often Rachmaninoff uses just the first few notes of this melody. He doesn't use the entire theme. Sometimes he'll take just the first 4 notes or 5 notes or 6 notes of the Dies Irae and uses them in symphonic compositions. And anyone familiar with this melody will recognize it instantly. Let's begin now with the ill-fated Symphony No. 1, the work from quite early in Rachmaninoff's career, which precipitated his first great creative and personal crisis. We're going to begin by listening to a little bit of the beginning of this symphony, the beginning of the first of 4 movements. Listen here for the Dies Irae, specifically in the strings. That was it. That was just the first 5 notes. And then he repeats that almost immediately. But that's just the briefest of slow introductions. And right where the tempo picks up, we hear the Dies Irae now functioning as the first theme proper of the movement. You'll hear it first in the clarinet, and then later on it's taken up by other instruments as well. So that was it in the clarinet. And then in a moment, we'll hear it once again in the clarinet and in the oboe. I'll point that out when it comes up. Okay, so now listen for the clarinet, but also for the oboe, presenting the Dies Irae in a kind of a dialogue between those 2 instruments. And you'll notice that he uses it in different rhythmic patterns. Sometimes he plays it at a slightly slower tempo or rhythm. Sometimes he plays it at a quicker rhythm, but it's still recognizable as the beginning of the Dies Irae. Before I move on to my next example, let me just pause for a few moments and ask our producer, Daniel, do we have any super chats so far?
We have a super sticker from Jamie. for 25 Mexican pesos. Thank you so much. We also have a super sticker from Christopher for 2.99 Canadian. Thank you so much. Also super chat from Mary Ellen for $4.99. She says thank you. And another super chat from Mary Ellen for 1.99. And she's asking, was that a Gregorian chant? But it was like 5 minutes ago.
Well, thank you very much for your generous donations. So yes, the Dies Irae, the original Dies Irae, is an example of a Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant being the official chant of the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, or since the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church still uses Gregorian chant in many parts of the world today. So yes, that is an example of Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant or plain chant, those two terms are relatively synonymous. The term plain chant simply means that the chant is unharmonized and unaccompanied. It's just, the technical term is monophonic. It's all the voices singing together in unison, singing the same melody in unison. So that's the Dies Irae. Let's turn our attention now to our second example, and this is the symphonic poem, The Isle of the Dead, composed around 1908. So we had an example just now from the beginning of Rachmaninoff's career. Now we look at an example from the middle of his career. I mentioned a few minutes ago that this is a piece that was inspired by a famous painting by a Swiss painter, Arnold Böcklin. That's spelled Bocklin. Arnold Böcklin. Actually, I should say a series of paintings. Böcklin did a whole bunch of paintings, some in black and white, some in color, on the subject of the Isle of the Dead. Daniel, can you please show the painting right now? There it is. So you can see there's an island surrounded by water, and right in the foreground there's a little boat which is approaching the island. So this is the idea from ancient Greek mythology of when a person dies, their soul crosses the river Styx and goes towards Hades or the afterlife or whatever. You can see there's a little white shrouded figure. That's the soul of the deceased person embarking upon the afterlife in the netherworld. Thanks very much for that. That's the painting. And now I'm going to play for you a little excerpt, just a snippet from Rachmaninoff's celebrated piece inspired by that painting that we just saw. And by the way, this piece, Rachmaninoff's The Isle of the Dead, is actually a fairly substantial piece. It's about 18, 19, 20 minutes long. I'm just going to play you a little snippet that comes about 3/4 of the way through the piece, where Rachmaninoff quotes the Dies Irae melody most explicitly. So let's listen to that. So you see, Rachmaninoff is here just isolating the first 4 notes of the Dies Irae, and we get it at different rhythmic levels. So we get it at a certain rhythmic level here in the clarinet and violas. Later on, the lower instruments, the bass strings are going to play it at half the speed, and then later on the horn will do the same. And then after a while, we'll get a solo violin playing the melody at a faster speed as well. And I'll point all of those things out as they come along. Can you hear how those low sounds, the low plucked strings, are doing the same thing, but at half the speed? And it's very soft, very faint, but at this point, Rachmaninoff introduces a horn, a single muffled horn, playing the Dies Irae melody very slowly and very softly. And and the solo violin just entered. So now the solo violin is going to play the Dies Irae at a faster speed, actually twice the speed of the initial clarinet entry. And then the violin is going to play triplets and then later on quadruplets. So there's a bit of an acceleration. And then at the end, the violin does a deceleration. It goes from quadruplets back to triplets and back to duplets. I think what Rachmaninoff is trying to suggest in this particular passage from this piece is the distant sound of tolling bells. And indeed, very often when Rachmaninoff uses the Dies Irae, even in other compositions, he uses it with associations with funereal bells. In fact, in the work called The Bells, the Edgar Allan Poe inspired work that I mentioned earlier, that's exactly how Rachmaninoff uses the Dies Irae. By the way, as I mentioned, that little excerpt that we just heard from The Isle of the Dead I'm taking it out of its full context. I don't want to give the impression that the piece as a whole is in any way repetitive or monotonous. It's actually a very rich, very attractive piece. It's not even entirely a dark and somber piece. There's also other themes, other episodes within the piece. It's really one of Rachmaninoff's greatest works. Let's turn our attention now to an example of the Dies Irae from near the end of Rachmaninoff's career, and this from the celebrated work, The Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini. Now, which theme of Paganini? Well, here Rachmaninoff is doing a set of variations, a set of 24 variations on the famous theme of Paganini's 24th Caprice for solo violin. And beginning with variation number 7, there's 24 variations in total. Beginning with variation number 7, Rachmaninoff introduces the Dies Irae in combination with or in counterpoint to elements of the Paganini theme. So for example, let's begin by listening to variation 7. And here the Paganini theme, that's the da-da-dee-da-dee-da-da-da, which is repeated through the many different variations. You'll hear the Paganini theme in the bassoon. Later on, you'll hear it in the violins, in some of the wind instruments. And here it's actually the piano that's playing the Dies Irae melody. Listen to that again and let me explain what's going on here. As I mentioned, the Dies Irae melody is being played by the piano, and it's actually harmonized. The melody here is harmonized. The Paganini theme, you can hear it's being played very slowly in the bassoon, the ba-da-da-da-dum, and occasionally, very quickly, we get little fragments of the Paganini tune in the violins. Da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. So listen for those different elements. Here's that same excerpt again. The next very important entry of the Dies Irae comes in variation 10, which is roughly midway through the piece. And the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, one of Rachmaninoff's most famous and beloved works, is typically around 20, 22 minutes in most performances. So variation 10 comes right near the middle, right near the 10-minute mark. So what you're going to hear in this excerpt is, again, the Dies Irae melody at first being played by the piano, here somewhat more loudly and more aggressively than in the previous variation, which was a little softer and a little gentler. So let's listen to the beginning of this excerpt. And again, the Dies Irae is once again in the piano here. get after that is a kind of jazzy syncopated version of the Dies Irae in the brass. Now, what do I mean by syncopated? Well, a syncopated rhythm, the term refers to rhythm. Syncopation refers to the practice of de-emphasizing a strong beat or a strong part of a beat and emphasizing a weak beat or a weak part of the beat. So it creates a kind of rhythmic disjunction or rhythmic dislocation. In this particular case, I said it's a jazzy syncopated rhythm. Ba 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 bum. Da, 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 da. So here's the sort of a jazzy syncopated version of the Dies Irae. Pretty cool, right? One thing I didn't mention about Rachmaninoff, when during the many years that he was living in the United States, he took a keen interest in American jazz. He was quite interested in the music of Black American musicians. He was a keen admirer of people like Duke Ellington. He frequently attended jazz concerts and performances. I think even Rachmaninoff himself played a little bit of jazz piano on the side. He was a huge admirer of George Gershwin, followed Gershwin's work very closely, the Rhapsody in Blue, the Concerto in F, American in Paris. He was very interested in those kinds of musical currents. So I think a little bit of that comes through in this passage that we just heard. And then the last little bit of variation 10, we get another syncopated treatment of the Dies Irae. Here, listen for it in the high bells, on the sort of bump, 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 on the offbeats, as we call them. And then the Dies Irae migrates downwards from the trumpets to the trombones and tuba. Okay, now that's such a cool excerpt, and there's so much here, so much going on here. Let's listen to it one more time. So again, we begin with the Dies Irae, played very rhythmically, very straight in the piano. Jazzy, Gershwin-inspired syncopated version here in the brass. And then the other syncopated version, this is the offbeats. Listen again for the high bells here. And then finally, the Dies Irae descending from the trumpets to the trombones and to the tuba. And sure enough, the Dies Irae makes some subsequent appearances in the Paganini variations, including quite spectacularly and quite gloriously in the very closing minute of the piece, where we get a big full orchestra, full brass statement of this Gregorian chant melody. Now, that's not the end of the story, because there are other works, actually quite a few other works by Rachmaninoff that make use of the Dies Irae, including some works for piano, and including Rachmaninoff's last two masterpieces, the Symphony No. 3 in A minor, and the magnificent symphonic dances for orchestra composed in the last year or two of Rachmaninoff's life. There's much more that one could say, but I thought taking a bit of a detour into his preoccupation with fatalism, with death, would be a nice way of drawing a comparison or connection with his great mentor, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, and also giving us a slightly different perspective on Rachmaninoff's work for those who may be only familiar with some of the piano concertos or with some of the solo piano music. Now you have a bit of an overview of one of his symphonies, one of his symphonic poems inspired by a famous painting, and a work for piano and orchestra dating from the end of his career. Before we sign off, Daniel, are there any more super chats or comments from the audience?
We have a super sticker from Mary Ellen for $1.99. Thank you so much. And that's all.
Thank you all very much for your generosity. Happy birthday, Sergei Rachmaninoff. Here's to 150 years and 150 more years of this great composer. Thank you all for joining me today. I hope to see some of you in Athens next week. And until then, take care and happy listening. Thank you very
And just
much.
quickly, the announcements. So
Yes, announcements.
upcoming shows today at 7 p.m. UK time. That's in 25 minutes. The Fountainhead Book Club for ARC UK members. The session will also be live streamed to YouTube members. And then tomorrow we have 3 shows coming. So at 4 p.m. UK time, it's the discussion on Leonard Peikoff's Keeping It Real with James Valiant and Robert Nasser on Everyday Heroes. Then at 6, it's the daily objective of the series Fixing Education. And it's going to be Studying Humanities at the University. Is it worth it? And it's going to be with Nikos and Ben Bayer. And then at 10 p.m. UK time, Cutting Edge with Lee Pearson, Robert Stubblefield, and Steve Richards on Critical Thought Experiments.
There you have it, folks. A lot going on at the Ayn Rand Center UK. Remember to subscribe and become a member. Lots of excellent content every day. I thank you all very much for joining me. Go listen to some Rachmaninoff and take care. Thanks very much.